Good morning. Usually I would say it is great to see you and to be with you. This time you'll be seeing me, I won't be seeing you. I'm seeing myself in a rectangle right in front of me on my screen. It occurred to me as I was setting up to record this sermon that we've seen each other in rectangles a lot over the past 3 years. So I guess this is in some ways a familiar view of me that you've seen on YouTube or on many Zooms. So obviously this is a little different from previous recorded sermons. I'm in my office for one difference, as you can see. There also might be some background office sounds. I don't know if the microphone will pick those up. The reason I'm in my office recording is because when we record in the sanctuary, I think it's probably better, but it also just takes some time and energy and effort from our volunteers, and I thought I would try to keep things easier this time. And so we have this little experiment. And the reason that I'm talking to you from a screen instead of in person is because I am out for my 20th wedding anniversary with Pam, and I was unable to find anyone who was able to fill in and preach. I contacted everyone in the Presbyterian, and everyone said, I'd love to, but I can't this time. So here we are. This will be a little different from other sermons in a lot of ways. One is that because I'll be out this weekend, I haven't had nearly as much time to prepare this sermon as I normally do. So it might be a little more casual and a little bit less fully baked. But I hope that you still get something out of it. So this morning I'm going to be talking about our readings from Philippians and from Exodus, and I'm going to be talking about love. And love not in the sense of its heights or its maximum or how far one can go in love. That's another sermon, another conversation. Here I'm talking about a minimum for love. And I'll get to that shortly. So in our readings from Philippians, we have Paul talking about his zeal for God and how, there wasn't anyone more zealous than he was in serving God, in serving the temple authorities in Jerusalem. There wasn't anyone more legally justified to do so. There wasn't anyone more outwardly righteous. And he was a zealot, and he talked about his zeal for what he did, which was, among other things, persecute and hunt and imprison and harm Christians, followers of Jesus. I don't think they had the name Christian yet. They were followers of the way of Jesus. And he was basically hunting them down. And so what he describes in this passage from Philippians is something he talks about in other places too, is his move from being zealously religious to being passionately in love. That is to say, from being in love with his movement and his authority and his organization to being in love with a person, with Jesus. And for Paul, this is some effusive language. Like, he will talk about things like, if I have to die to be with Jesus, then I will, and I will suffer anything to be with Jesus. And if I lose everything in my life, I'll count it all as gain if I get to be with Jesus. And usually this language is kind of set aside for prophets and mystics and other kind of religious weirdos. But you can kind of picture Paul in a way. An image I had was like Paul with a notebook writing Paul plus Jesus and then drawing a heart around the names in his notebook, moving from zeal for authority to zeal for a person. It isn't that one is superior to the other. Like, zeal for an organization isn't necessarily better or worse than zeal for a person. Same with love. Love for an organization or a movement isn't necessarily better or worse than love for a person. People do good and bad things out of love, whether it's love for a group or an individual. I mean, if you have someone who is passionate about Doctors Without Borders, that'll be very different from someone, who's passionate about being a Proud Boy. And those two people will have a very different impact on the people around them and a very different way of life. In the same way, we know that people can do incredible things and be lifted up and ennobled by their love for another person. And then people can also do some incredibly stupid, sometimes hurtful, sometimes harmful things out of their love for a person. One of the things that matters in Paul's case is the person whom he loves. In this case, a person who calls on him to die to himself, a person who calls on him to risk his own life rather than inflict suffering on others. And it also matters what Paul's view of love is, like what he thinks he owes this person, Jesus, when he says he loves him. Moving on to the Exodus passage, the Ten Commandments are also about love. So when the Hebrew Scriptures talk about God's love, you may have heard in the New Testament there are different words for love. One of them is agape, one of those is eros, one of them is philios. You may have heard sermons or learned about those in Bible study. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the most common word for God's love, when it talks about God's love, is chesed. This is often defined as covenantal love. It's the kind of love that you have for someone with whom you have a covenant. This is why I think, or one of the reasons why marriage is a really common metaphor in the Hebrew Scriptures for the love between God and the people of Israel. It is like the love of a married couple. And think about this in context, right? Because the view of marriage back then is different from the view that we have now, different in a lot of ways. Back then, you wouldn't, meet an individual person and go on dates with them and then move in with them and then ask them to marry you because you're in love and then ask your family and friends to gather for your wedding and get married, right? That's a modern approach to marriage. In the ancient world, marriage was not that. It may have involved love, it may have involved a lot of affection, but it wasn't two people falling in love and choosing one another. A marriage was a covenant between two families. It was an agreement through these two individuals forming a new kind of family unit. It was an agreement or an alliance. It was a covenant. And so in the Hebrew Scriptures, the covenantal love, the covenant of marriage, is often contrasted with lust, kind of the negative, dark mirror reflection of covenantal love is lust. And lust is always destructive, right? So think about David lusting after Bathsheba, and so he has Uriah killed and then has access to Bathsheba. Lust is this desire to possess. It's selfish. It doesn't have boundaries. It's wanting someone. Whereas covenantal love is different in that it has transparency. Like when you enter into a covenant, everyone knows what's happening. Everyone knows what the rules are. Everyone knows what the agreement on the table is. And a covenant is mutual. There's this idea that both of us benefit from the covenant and both of us also contribute to the covenant. And there are boundaries to a covenant, right? There are things it applies to and things that it doesn't. And those are agreed on and ideally upheld by both sides. And there are clear expectations in a covenant. Like we make a covenant, this is what I expect from you, this is what you can expect from me. Written into the covenant might even be what happens if we don't live up to those expectations, right? So it's different from the destructive nature of lust in a lot of ways, and those are often contrasted in the Hebrew scriptures, covenantal love versus destructive lusting. So the Ten Commandments, as a covenant, just as the covenant with Noah and the covenant with Abraham and the covenant with Moses, are expressions of God's love, God's chesed for the people, sometimes through an individual, sometimes with a group. These covenants are God's expression of love, and keeping these covenants are the expression of the people's love back to God, right? Understanding and keeping the agreement. It sounds kind of legalistic, but this is just the metaphor that they had for love at the time, the best expression of love that they had culturally at the time was a well-kept, fair covenant that allowed both sides flourishing and happiness. And so if you look at the Ten Commandments as an expression of God's love through a covenant, it opens up a way of understanding them, I think. Looking at the Ten Commandments, the first 4 commandments out of 10, 40% of them, are about faithfulness to God in the covenant itself. Basically, they're kind of, the first 4 are about God saying, don't cheat on me. If we look at this as kind of a marriage, or similar to a marriage covenant, don't cheat on me. Don't cheat on me with other gods. Don't cheat on me with images of other gods. Don't insult me by disrespecting my name. And don't cheat on me by skipping the day that we've set aside to be together. Okay, so far. The next 6 commandments in the 10 commandments change gear, I think, and they are more about preventing harm. They're more about making sure that harm, various kinds of harm, are prevented. So the first of those is about the familial bond. Honor your father and your mother so that you can live long in the land. Seems like kind of an odd thing to have in the Ten Commandments. Like it's the kind of thing that my parents would bring up with me. There was a commandment. You're supposed to honor them. Sometimes joking, sometimes not. And maybe that's the same for you. But think about, again, the context, right? For the ancient Hebrews, there's no judiciary, there's no legislature, there's no police, there's no soldiers, there's no Social Security, there's no Medicaid, there's no Medicare, there's no social safety net apart from families. That's all there is. It is a large tribe made up of clans, with clans made up of families. And so that familial bond is the heart of society in a real way. There's nothing to fall back on. If that familial bond falls apart, that little piece of society falls apart. There's nowhere for those people to go. There's nothing that they can do. And so maintaining that familial bond is a way of keeping people safe and making sure that as a group we function at a basic level. After that, you have 5 limits on particular kinds of harm and sources of harm, right? So obviously, murder is harm, so thou shalt not kill. Adultery is harm to a person you have a covenant with, and harm to the person you don't have a covenant with whom you commit adultery. Stealing is obviously harm. Taking something from someone that isn't yours is harm. Bearing false witness is harm. Not just lying in general, but specifically false testimony against someone. trying to leverage your neighbors to harm them for you by lying about something they did or something they owe you, and trying to hurt them that way. And then, of course, the Ten Commandments end with not coveting. This idea, again, similar to lust, that the desire to possess something that you have no right to is the source of tremendous amounts of harm then and now. And of course, the Ten Commandments aren't sufficient, right? They're a beginning. As we've talked about before, even in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Ten Commandments are expanded out to include something like 600 commandments, and then was expanded out from there to be a whole legal code. But they're a beginning. I think it's interesting that that beginning is focused on the faithfulness of a relationship and on limiting harm as its two priorities. There's a favorite ethics book of mine that I read in one of my ethics electives in seminary, one of my interests in seminary, in addition to all the other things you have to study in seminary, because it's a lot, was ethics. And so in one of the classes that I took, one of the texts that we read is a book entitled Love Does No Harm. And it's one of my favorite books, period, and it's one of my favorite books on ethics. It's a few decades old now, but like good philosophy and good ethics, it still holds up. And it's a pretty slim book. It's accessible, and it makes a direct and compelling point, at least one that I find compelling, with regard to love, that love does no harm. One of the interesting things about the book is that it separates love from a particular feeling, or a particular emotion. People do terrible harm, filled with particular feelings. They do terrible harm filled with emotions. Just a few examples. I think half of all women who are killed in the United States are killed by an intimate partner, which is appalling. And that a woman is 15 times more likely to be harmed or killed by someone she knows than by a stranger. And so I don't have to belabor the point, right? We know that people filled with strong feelings, even if they say those feelings are love, can do terrible things, can abuse, can harm. I imagine we get it. I imagine many of us have experienced it one way or another ourselves. But I like this idea of love doing no harm because it's a simple principle, right? If someone says they're loving and yet they're doing harm, I have a very solid foundation to say, no, you're not loving. That is not love. I believe you may have strong feelings, right? You might love the way this person makes you feel. You might want this person to be around all the time. You might be jealous when this person is with other people. Those might all be true. Those are real feelings, but no, you are not loving. It's a limit. It's a boundary. It's an edge to love that if you've gone past it, okay, you're not loving anymore. You're doing something else. And I wish that boundary didn't come up so often when talking about love, but it does. Paul did a lot of harm. He doesn't go into a lot of detail, but he spent years of his adult life focused on harming followers of Jesus. That was his job. He would travel around the Mediterranean world harming followers of Jesus. And then one day on the road to Damascus, he met this Jesus, and Jesus asked him, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Or another way of saying it could be, Paul, why are you harming me? And this was a turning point for Paul. He turned from a kind of love, a kind of zeal that justified him doing harm, to a kind of love and a kind of zeal that didn't justify that any longer. And so many other things changed about Paul's life. But a really important thing that changed about Paul's life is that he no longer did harm. Because if you look at Paul's ministry, from that point forward, he didn't harm anyone, and he could have. There's nothing about saying you are zealous for Jesus. There's nothing about saying you love Jesus that prevents you from doing harm. Plenty of people have done harm in Jesus' name. Paul could have too. He could have traded one justification for harming people for another justification for harming people. But instead, he stopped. And I think it mattered who he was loving. The fact that he was zealous with love for Jesus mattered. And I think the way that he saw himself as loving Jesus also mattered. So, love does no harm. And we see Paul move from what I would say was a false love to what I think we have reason to say was a true love. And one of the ways we can see that is because Paul ceased doing harm in the name of his love. And that is also a way that we can make sure that our loves are true as well. Amen. And I'll see you next week.